Cool.
Okay. I guess we're on. Let's see.
That's cool.
And let's see. Is it running? Oh, there we go. Let me just check the audio levels and stuff. Could you say something, Danilo?
Hello, 1, 2, 3. Is that okay?
Can you say something, Danilo? Ah, this is perfect. This is perfect.
Okay.
Okay, nice.
Nice.
Let me put my music back on. I need my music. Okay. Nice. Welcome to the stream. I'm here with Danilo, one of my dear colleagues. And we are going to talk about state and state management and all the stuff related to that. And I thought first, Danilo, we could just talk about from an extremely abstract perspective, because we talk about like local state and global state and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
And here I have a drawing of an app. And this is like a global scope, and typically like global state stores, they live in this global scope. But the thing is that there is certain state that really shouldn't live in the global scope. So state that can live in the global scope is like, for our example today, is like CodeSandbox API, which is just like the connection to our API. That can be like global. It doesn't matter if you're signed in or signed out, or which page you're on or whatever. That can live there. And other things could be like visibility state, for example. It doesn't matter. That can perfectly fine be scoped to the global scope. But then for us, we have like this other scope, and let's make that scope orange. Let's see, like so, and then this could be what I call this is like the authentication scope. And that's basically if you are signed in or signed out, that should really like remount that scope. So anything that lives inside here in terms of state and also UI and everything, that should be determined if you're authenticated or not. So that if you're signed in and you work on something, you load up a bunch of state and then you sign out, everything should be completely gone. So that if like you imagine sitting at like a public computer and someone comes back and wants to sign in again, they shouldn't have any access to any of the state that you had when you were signed in. And typically this is like solved by just reloading the page when you sign out, which is perfectly fine. But that's like, for this discussion, that's considered a hack. It's because you aren't scoping your state properly. That's why you do that reload. But arguably you should do that regardless. But it's just to talk about scopes. And then we have, where is it? Where did it go? There we go. And then we have the specific, let's see. So this will be the editor scope. One thing about the authentication scope is that it can hold state that's tied to your session. It doesn't have to be like the current repo or sandbox you're looking at, but it can be like a cache of any state that you want to bring back later. So that can be like part of your session, but the cache is gone when you sign out. So cache, etc. And then you have like the editor scope, and that's like state and management of state that only lives for that specific instance of the editor. So that will be, for us, that will be picture, for example. Picture client. And it will be basically any state or management of state related to the editor, like VM usage, or I don't know, layout, maybe anything that's like specific to the current sandbox or repo, or sorry, branch you're looking at. So the point is that if you want to change to a different editor scope, meaning you move to like a new branch or a different sandbox, we would completely like eliminate the state and the management of that state from the current scope, and then we would remount with a new scope. And as I said, if you want to keep anything around, you would keep that in the authentication scope.
So it seems to me that the editor scope is more like a session-based scope, and for example, the rest is more like stateless. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the global scope doesn't necessarily hold any state now, and then the authentication scope we hold the state, the current state for the user, and then the editor scope is more like a session-based state.
Yeah, I see that perspective, and it's funny because when I first implemented this, I called it session scope because that describes better. Okay, this is state that's part of your session, and then this is, I could call this repo or sandbox scope. Then it's more to the point of what's in there and what's like removed when you navigate the page. So in a session scope, you could have a cache of any sandbox you visit. So when you revisit that sandbox, it has it from the cache because it's like part of your session. But if you sign out, your session scope is gone and there is no cache of any sandbox or anything.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And this is interesting to me because I never thought about this stuff before. And the reason is that like if you only have a global scope, you would like put your session data and you would put your the stuff you're currently looking at all in a global context. And that can create conflicts. Like if you move from one sandbox to the next, you might have data from the other sandbox, depending on how you structure it. Or even worse, it's like if you're signed in and you sign out, you might have state from the old session, stuff like that. But this was just to explain like the approach of state scoping for the code we're going to look at. And then naming these things, it's always tricky, right? So
yeah.
What I wanted to show you is this amazing application I built for us. And it's called, what did I call it? Impact. There we go. So now we're signed out because I'm trying to hit our test sandbox main branch. And then when I sign in, it should work.
So this is CodeSandbox application running Impact.
Yes.
Right?
So I just created a new page.
Cool.
Called Impact. So we have access to CodeSandbox API. We have access to Picture Client and everything. I have no idea what happened here. What happened? That was weird. Oh, are we getting... Oh my god. Oh, there we go. That was weird. I think we got some 500 from, like, we're running this dev server, and it's currently giving us some 500 errors because it's loading so many different files, and our proxy has a hard time dealing with it. So, anyways, this is the amazing app. I can sign in. It loads up the branch, and then it connects to Pitcher, and then it shows the ID. And if I sign out, we're back here. And if I sign back in, hopefully it works now. Why doesn't it work? Oh, this is so weird. And then it just stops. It's almost like it's not, the request is not going through. Yeah, I have no idea, but I don't think it's going to block us.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, I just tested this last night, and then for some reason, maybe it's because
Maybe
of
so.
my.
Maybe someone deployed something to stream.
Maybe.
And someone just testing a PR there.
Yeah. But anyways, it's not that important how the app looks like, what the app looks like, but we can take a look at the actual code for this.
Sure.
So I thought we could like look at the UI first, because that gives you like, now we looked at the UI, and then we can look at the UI code, and then we can look into like the state management of that. So in the main file, we just have the main component, and it's observing some state. It's the authentication state. And what we return is global error boundary, because we have some suspense magic in here that I want to talk about as well.
Cool.
And then we mount which I call the authentication scope, which should probably be called session scope. And the key is your authentication state. So whenever the authentication state changes from authenticated to unauthenticated, it basically remounts the whole app and everything within it. So that whatever you put from here and down is safe. Like, it will be removed.
It's so amazing to see the key prop React component, because it's so powerful and people don't realize how they can use it to fix some problems.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the way this authentication scope is defined is that we just create it's just a React provider, and then we give it, okay, what stores are going to be accessible within, let's just call it session. Can we just rename it to session? I think that's a better name.
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, let's just rename it here, and then we can. So in the session scope, we want to have a store that deals with editor data. So this is like, editor data is like grabbing sandboxes and branches and stuff like that. And that also holds the cache for these sandboxes and branches. And then if we move into the editor loader, and this is interesting to me, and now we kind of get to the suspense thing, is that what I noticed using suspense is that you have to create this other component wrapping it. So you kind of get these loading components where you define your suspense, and you might define an error boundary, and then you need to go in and like do the actual data fetching, because you can't do the data fetching here. It needs to happen within a component of a child of the suspense. So that's what's happening here, is that we have this suspense, we have the editor data loader, and we use the editor data store. Sorry for the like long names here. It's just to be extremely explicit about what they are.
It makes sense.
Oh, thank you, neighbor. I talked to him this morning, and he said he was going to saw down some stuff outside, and he's probably going to do that exactly when I'm doing or we're doing the stream, and he does. Anyways, so here we can go and we can get a branch, but we get the branch by suspending. So this is just the ID of the branch, which is a combination of owner, repo, branch, and the workspace ID. And that will just give us the branch data, which is currently just a result of this query.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just check if we don't have a branch ID, we just throw to the arrow boundary that there is no branch here. Or if everything's okay, let's go and connect to Pitcher using that branch ID.
So just to make it clear, when you call get branch suspend, it's a synchronous operation, but
Yes.
right here it looks like synchronously
Yeah.
because of the suspense boundary, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the interesting thing about, and we'll talk more about queries and mutations, but this
Mm-hmm.
get branch is defined as a query or queries because you can pass in like different things you want to fetch. It's not just one thing. But then you can choose how do I actually want to consume this. Do I want to consume it by suspension? Do I want to consume it by just fetching it, which gives us the query state. So then you can check the status of the query. Like, is it fulfilled? Is it pending? Is it rejected? And then
Interesting.
there are other ways as well to access that query. And as you say, like when you suspend it, it looks synchronous, but it's under the hood, it's not. Like when it's
Yeah.
pending, it throws to the suspense boundary. If it causes an error, it will throw to the error boundary. And when it's resolved, it will continue execution of the component, which is a beautiful thing within this component. But as I said, it's a little bit awkward that I need this wrapping editor loader. Because
Yeah.
what I could do, I could say fetch instead, and then I could just check if branch status pending. And then I could just return loading here. And then I wouldn't need this additional thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. So I'm wondering like what there are good use cases for suspense, I would imagine, but sometimes you don't want suspense. It's like I don't think it will be like when suspense kind of lands and it's like officially supported. It's not like we move to suspense from how we did it before. It's just it makes sense in some scenarios.
Yeah. Because yeah, I think the suspense there's this thing when the request is really fast, it doesn't render anything, even the loading state.
Yeah,
So which
that's
which
true.
is cool. Like we don't see this uh, visual flip between loading and the fulfilled state.
Hmm.
So if a query takes long, then you see the loading and then your final data.
That's a really good point. Like if we did the other one with the query state and we manually checked if it was pending, it would show that loading state regardless.
Yeah.
But with suspense, it might not have shown it. That's a really good point. Um, but I would love to see a way to use suspense without having to do this. Like it to me, it would make more sense if you could like do this suspend something like this. So you would actually just suspend the component kind of thing.
Oh, I
Because
see.
then you would kind of avoid creating those things. But I don't have enough experience with this to like.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a good idea, but you still need to pass two components, like the fallback
Yeah,
and the children.
yeah, exactly.
But it's less boilerplate for sure.
Yes, yes, yes. Cool. And then when we actually have a branch ID, we go into like the picture loader. And the interesting thing about loading picture is that it's not strictly a promise, like instantiating picture. It is partly instantiating a promise and resolving that promise, because then you get the actual picture client. But it also has this callback where you get events on the progress of instantiating picture. So you want to do two different things. So this store that I call picture initializer store does two things. It fetches an instance of picture, which is a promise. It's a query, but then it also has state that shows you the progress of fetching. And it's funny how like we can have these really good primitives for like subscribing to events or managing a promise, but then suddenly you're going to do both, and then it's like, how do you kind of make those things fit together? But we can look at these stores after we've gone through the UI. But the point is that here I couldn't use suspense in this case, because if I used suspense, we wouldn't get these updates to progress.
Oh, the progressive bar, yeah.
Yeah, so it's so interesting to me that when we talk about this concept of handling a query, um, it's more about different ways of consuming a promise. Like sometimes you can use suspense, sometimes you just want to analyze, not analyze, but access the state of the query. And in other situations, you might just want to await the promise that it represents. Do you hear the the noise?
I can hear a bit,
Uh,
but yeah, don't worry.
yeah.
It's not disturbing at all.
Anyways, so this is why I'm using fetch here, because it gives me the query state, and then I just check if it's fulfilled. Then we actually return the editor, giving the branch ID and picture client, which is what the editor needs to do its thing. And just to be clear here, I'm only giving the branch ID, but this would actually be the editor data, which I forgot to refactor before we started the session. Because we're actually downloading the editor data here, the branch data. But in the demo, I just have an ID.
Mm-hmm.
So this would normally be editor data, and then you would get the editor data from the thing up
Oh,
here. So because those are the two things that we need to, like if we think about this, when we go to an actual branch or a sandbox, we want picture client and we want like editor data and so on.
mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about this is that, and what's important about this is that when we're in this scope of a branch or a sandbox, we don't want to asynchronously access editor data or picture client. We want that to be done. We want it to already be fetched, so that when we actually open the editor, we always have, like technically typing wise, we always have editor data available and we always have a picture client available.
Yeah,
So another aspect of these scopes is that they create this separation of a synchronicity, meaning that uh, in this session scope, we had like our editor loader component and we had our picture loader component. And they were responsible for preparing the data and showing like a good loading experience to the user,
mm-hmm.
and then provide what this scope requires, which is the actual editor data and picture client. So
Yeah.
yeah,
This is so cool because I can remember seeing the code base. We have a lot of data checking. If
yeah,
it's loading, it's loaded, and now we have this. data boundary
Yeah.
when you are sure that the data is there, it's
Yes.
ready to be used. So it's really cool. It's a game changer for
Exactly.
me.
Oh, I love that because it's like this impact project is just taking like all our experiences and iterating and finding good terminology and approaches to making things more expressive and less indirection and all of this stuff. But I like what you say about these scopes isn't only about scoping state and disposing of that state when the scope is
Mhm.
unmounted, but it's also a boundary for data fetching. So between these scopes, you would ensure that when this scope loads, you already have data loaded for you. So you don't have to, as you say, do these checks all the time. Is it actually loaded? Which feels so unnatural um, when you write
Like,
code.
yeah, need to just rely that data is there.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that happens, especially in global state stores, is that you have these states where, like, you might have. Let's talk about editor data. Like, you might have some editor data, but you don't know in a global context because it hasn't been loaded yet
Mhm.
in the global scope. So what you do is that you take like optionally we have editor data, and then when you write your code in components, you might use the hashbang thing because you know that in that component, we know that the editor data is loaded. Like that component wouldn't mount if we didn't have fetched the editor data. So you just like override the typing. And for me, that creates such an itch. It's like the code doesn't understand what you understand as a developer.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the motivation behind this, like using these scopes. It's not about like state security primarily, and even data boundaries. It's just that the scope understands what you understand as a developer, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
um
Yeah,
anyways,
I can say this is more about the development experience
yeah.
uh, than anything else.
Yeah, and it's funny because the stuff we're talking about here, this is not something that applies to every single app. Like with a global
Sure.
scope, you get so far. Like you get so far. But like the stuff that we're working on, it's just so insanely complicated. There's so much asynchronous stuff happening. There's so much sharing of state um, that having concepts like this can help improve the developer experience. But anyways, editor. So in the editor, we now have the editor data, which is reflected as branch ID here, and we have picture client. And then what we do is that we create a scope for the editor. And as I said, maybe this should be called like editor, like the whole thing is an editor. Like that's the thing. Like it's
Mhm.
difficult with the terminology, but uh, branch or sandbox scope provider. Just to be very explicit here. So what we're
So,
doing is that we're creating a scope for this branch, or if it's a sandbox, and then we give it a store to access the data, like the editor data, um, and do other stuff that we might implement shortly. And then we have like a picture store. So
mhm.
whenever you access the picture store, you will have an instance of picture. And this is where we can implement
Mm.
stuff later.
Mhm.
Um, so
Are you going to show this story? I don't want to to go
yeah, I wasn't
ahead of
sure how to approach this because I didn't want to jump back and forward. And I wasn't sure, should I start with the stores or should I start with the UI? But we'll immediately jump into the stores after we kind of gone through
Okay,
the UI.
I'm so
Um,
curious about this story.
yeah. uh, yeah, I want to keep the suspense. Did you see what I did there? I said suspense, like suspense
Yeah.
boundaries. Sorry. I'm such a dad. Let's see. So what we're doing here is that we're creating a scope for the branch or the sandbox, and then when we create these scopes, we say what stores we want to be part of that scope, and then when we mount the scope, we can give initial data to the stores. So in this case, we're giving the editor store the editor data, and we're giving the picture store picture client. So they are like initialized with that data. And then any component within here has access to, well, basically any of the stores that we have been referencing, because they are like deep in the innermost nested scope here.
That's cool.
So if we look at the top bar, no, not the top bar. Don't I have anything? Yeah, sidebar. Does it actually use, do I have a good example here? Yeah, okay. So the code editor, the thing that actually shows opened, it's using the editor store, and the editor store is exposing state that it can use.
I see. And at this point, the editor store is already initialized.
Yes.
And you know it's already in it.
Yeah. So the thing that's like tricky, and this is like related to context providers in React, is that like components are completely decoupled. Like when you look at a component, you don't know where this component is mounted in the component tree, which is kind of the beauty of the thing, but also the complicated thing. So there is a chance that you might, just like a context provider, you might use a context that's invalid for this component because it's just mounted somewhere else where it shouldn't be mounted. But that, with the impact currently, that throws an error, just like you would do with a context provider, like we do in V2 now. And that is like not ideal. Ideally, there should be a way for consumption of a scope to like actually make that you want the complete decoupling of components, but you want the coupling of scopes to components. And I'm not sure how you can really do that.
Make it like a context aware.
Yeah, context aware.
It's
yeah,
mounted.
Yes, and that's
an interesting challenge.
Yeah, exactly, because it's complete opposites. Like the power of decoupling is ruining the power of context awareness, kind of thing. But the important thing is that this editor can now be consumed, and when it can be consumed, it will be just the editor. There's nothing asynchronous about accessing the editor data. So another thing that's interesting about, before we jump into the stores, is the thing I mentioned about doing something seemingly simple, but how difficult it can actually be. So we have this authentication store, which should probably be called session store. And we have talked about queries, right? We've used a query to fetch the data of the branch or the sandbox, a branch in this case. And we also used a query to load up picture. But you also want to do something else. You want to change something, like what we typically call mutation. And it's so fascinating to me that you have like if you want to do a query or a mutation, it's the exact same thing from like an HTTP perspective. Like you probably change the verbs but it's an HTTP request. That's the point. But even an abstraction over there, a query and a mutation is also just a promise. But on an abstraction level over that again is very different, like how you want to consume and manage the query as opposed to the mutation. So like for a query, it makes sense to use suspense. But I would argue that you wouldn't use suspense with a mutation. Like you wouldn't create a component and suspend a mutation and only
Yeah,
render
totally.
the component when the mutation is done. Maybe there is a case for that, but not typically. You would want to refetch a query, but you wouldn't want to refetch a mutation. You would just do the mutation again. And then, yeah, and you wouldn't want to, like, it's kind of related to suspense. You wouldn't want to run, even though you didn't use suspense, just like we used the fetch here to initialize picture to give us the query state. You wouldn't want to do that with a mutation. Like with a mutation, you want to subscribe to the state of the mutation, but you wouldn't want to run the mutation when you create that subscription to the mutation,
Yep.
if that makes sense. So that's why there are like two different primitives with impact. You have queries and you have mutations, and they have different methods where the mutation is the simplest one. So just to go through the example, what we're doing here is that we have this button where you handle sign in and sign out. And we want to manage the state of those buttons based on the state of the mutation. So when you sign in, the sign in mutation, we subscribe to that. So we get like the mutation state. And then we have the sign out mutation that we also subscribe to. And then we check if we are authenticated. We want to return a button that says sign in. And when you click it, we call sign out. And we disabled it if the sign out mutation status is pending. And then if it's unauthenticated, we have a sign in button, and you do the mutation on the sign in, and then we can just listen to the status of the mutation. And the point is that any component can do this. So if you want to lock something down anywhere in the app related to signing in or signing out, you can just do that. You can just subscribe to the mutation anywhere in the app, which is a really powerful concept. And then if, I don't know, if we wanted to like show an error here. Oh, my computer
Any part of the application can do this because this lives in a higher scope, right?
Yes, it lives in the branch scope.
Branch scope.
Oh, sorry. This is in the session scope. Sorry.
Session scope.
So what if we kind of want to figure out if something went wrong with signing out, for example? You could do that by, again, just pointing to the sign out mutation. And you could say, okay, if it's rejected, you could show some kind of error. I don't know. Sign out mutation error. Oh, reason. Sorry, that's a reason. Oh yeah, I guess this is because of. Oh yeah, the reason is unknown. Sorry. There we go. So again, you can use that subscription to figure out, okay, if it was rejected, let's just show that reason in the UI. Or maybe you wanted to like do an effect. Maybe you wanted to show a notification instead. So you could do sign out mutation status. And then if the sign out mutation status equals, oh, come on, rejected, you could do something like show notification. So it's really interesting how like you have these requests you want to do, but when you add this like query / mutation abstraction on top of it, they all become subscribable for the UI. So they know when anything in the app does a sign in or a sign out. And in our case, we don't only have a sign in button. Like if you try to fork a sandbox and you're not signed in, we sign you in with the fork button. Or if you try to write some code and we're going to seamlessly transition you into a fork, we also call the sign in. So it's really interesting how this just enables the whole UI to understand when requests are being made, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes more predictable
Yeah, and it's basically
interface properties.
removing promises from React. Like React doesn't and shouldn't like deal with promises, and this abstraction just makes all promises a subscription,
Mm-hmm.
which is what React deals very well with. So, okay, the stores.
Yeah,
The
the
stores.
stars.
The
So
stores.
curious to see how it's like.
Where should we start? Okay, let's just do. So like a store isn't like normally you think about stores, you think about a store defining some state, but that's not the case in Impact. It's actually just a function, and whatever you return from that function is like what you consume from the store in other stores and
Mm.
other components. And it doesn't matter what you return. You can return anything. You can return some state, you can return some methods, or you can return, in this case, we're just returning the instance of the CodeSandbox API. And it's interesting because this one is global, so we could just have moved it like outside here and just imported it directly globally. It would kind of be the same thing. But what's cool about this is that if you're writing tests, you can go in and you can just expose your own scope, your testing scope. And in that
Mm-hmm.
testing scope, this CSB API store is like a different implementation. So that's also interesting. Like in testing, you can intercept these scopes in your app to create mocked stores. Yeah, so that's not very interesting. And then we have our authentication store. And what's interesting about this authentication store is that they act as a translator often between promise-based libraries and React. Because as I said, React is really bad at consuming promises. Not that it's
Mm-hmm.
like badly implemented, it's just not like that's not the paradigm, or that's not the goal of React. It's
Yeah.
subscription based. So what we do here is that we just take our CodeSandbox API, and then we go and grab the session state, and we put that into a signal that comes from Impact. It doesn't have to be a signal. It could be like an observable from RxJS or observable from MobX or whatever other state primitive that's out there. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
Impact ships with its own signal. And then we listen to changes on the session, and then we update that state. So that means that when React is consuming the state, we return the value of that signal. So if it's observing, if the component is observing and it accesses this signal, it will automatically reconcile when this
Oh,
signal
it's
changes.
interesting.
And this is this is how what should I compare it to? Like MobX. I guess it's closest to MobX, because in MobX you have this observer thing you put around your components.
Mm-hmm.
But in MobX you use proxies to track state access. But as I said, you could use a MobX observable here if you wanted to. So Impact doesn't really force you into certain state primitives. It rather gives you a way to manage whatever state primitives you choose using these
Mm-hmm.
scopes and these stores. And then we have the sign in and sign out, and they are just wrapped in a mutation. So
Mm-hmm.
we're calling
So
sign in with a mutation. Mm-hmm.
so the impact introduces this new can I say architecture to consume
Mm-hmm.
data, but it also gives you the tool to 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 make it possible. But
Yeah.
you could use different tools to
Yes.
use this same architecture.
Exactly. And the thing I've experienced, like especially working on Overmind, is that there's so many different kinds of state challenges. Like we just talked about mutations and queries. Those are state challenges that are different from this session state,
Mhm,
because these are promise based, while the session state is subscription based. Like you want an initial value and you want to subscribe and update that value. But you have other state challenges as well. You have like race conditions, which RxJS is really good at handling. So if you have a very complicated asynchronous flow, like Impact doesn't say that you need to solve that with a signal or whatever. You can
mhm.
just as naturally use RxJS. Or if you have a complicated user flow, you can use XState, for example. It just as naturally exposes that as any other state primitive,
Mhm.
which like in Overmind, I would like develop different primitives specific to Overmind to handle different state challenges. But here it's just this fundamental organizing and management of state primitives.
I see. And could you elaborate a bit more of what is use cleanup and
Mm,
why you are using here?
yeah. So the authentication store um, is part of the like our session scope. So when you are so let's say you're signed in, and when you sign out, we're going to unmount the session scope, which means that this store will also like unmount.
Hmm.
And that is what use cleanup does. It just gives you a way to register a callback that runs whenever this store is like unmounted, cleaned up.
Hmm.
So
Is
it's kind
it
of like
compared
use.
to, sorry,
Oh, please go.
is it compared to use effect,
Mm-hmm.
function return,
Mm-hmm.
or or something?
Yes. So it's exactly the same as use effect conceptually, though use effect would be something like this. But the point of these stores is that they run outside of React. It's not part of React's reconciliation loop. So um, what that enables is that it guarantees that like this function will only run once, and that's when the store
Hmm.
instantiates. It doesn't matter what React does in terms of reconciliation, how many components tries to access this store, it will only run once.
I see.
And what that frees us from, which is maybe the most amazing thing, is the reconciliation loop. You can, just like in solid.js also guarantees that your component will only run once when it's instantiated.
Hmm.
And that means that you're free to just write code. You don't have to put stuff into effects. You can just instantiate stuff you need. Uh, anything you don't return becomes private, and you can just do stuff. Like I can just toggle state or whatever, and I can go and say state current value equals whatever unauthenticated. So you can just do it. You don't have to think about React's reconciliation loop, but you still
And
get like
then,
this familiar pattern of like um like I've seen it in a few articles, but they talk about like the hooks pattern. And the hooks pattern is really a function that's able to like use other functions, kind of. But the important thing that's like under the hood is that it creates like an underlying scope, which is the component scope. But here we are creating our own scopes that are broader, so we can share the context of these stores or the instances of these stores. So it gets a bit technical, and it's like, why do I need to care about that? And the point is, you shouldn't care about it. It should like feel natural that instead of you dealing with state and management and state from like component scopes, you just choose scopes by component trees. Those component trees representing, in this case, a branch or your app, or it's global, like it doesn't matter. Cool. And then I guess we can look at, yeah, so this is editor data store. This is also part of the session scope. And this is the thing that allows you to go and grab a branch. And here I'm using a primitive called, I'm using the CodeSandbox store, but I'm also using a primitive called queries. And just like if you use query or use SWR, the first argument is like the key. This is how it caches. So
this primitive will return the suspend method, the patch method,
yes,
everything.
Exactly.
Cool.
So it's
does
just
a lot. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty like, and I really, so like looking at use query and use SWR, like I love the concept of wrapping promises in an API that makes it easier to consume that promise in React. That makes a ton of sense to me. The thing that kind of broke it for me is that they are, even though the cache is shared, the query itself is defined like per component, unless you can use like a hook, I guess, but it can't like interact with state outside of React. It's like it's bound to React itself. So what this gives is a way to like just define the query. Like it's literally one place you define the query, and then you can interact with it in a component. But you can also do things like if we jump into in the editor store. So if I were to use if I were to use this thing, I could still say, maybe I wanted to do something here, like, do something. I could still say, and let's make that async. So I want to, before I move on here, I want to await CSP API. Oh, sorry, it wasn't the CSP. It was the editor data store. That's where we have our query. So as I said, one thing is that you're able to like suspend and all that stuff. But what we can also do, we can, let's see. Doesn't it show me? Do I have to pass in? Oh, sorry. I always forget that. I can also just get the value of whatever. So that means that this will also resolve just as a normal promise. So my point is, it doesn't matter the context you're trying to consume these queries and mutations. You can choose to suspend, to subscribe to the state of the query, or you can just consume the promise as is. Because when you work in this context, like the component is calling do something, you might have some dependency to a query that you want to manage before you move on with some other logic, for example.
Mhm.
And then you could
So
like, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead. Finish your
Yeah,
point.
I was just going to say, and then you can do like mutation and then make this async. So again, like here you could go in and you could create a mutation. So now any component can like listen to what's happening when someone calls do something. And within that mutation, you are waiting for a promise from a query. Like the point is that the flexibility is just there. It's not, you don't have to orchestrate stuff to get access to data. It's just available. Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw now that you have get value and set value.
Mm-hmm.
So this means you could create optimistic UI and it's still waiting for the mutation resolve. You know what I mean?
Not quite.
Like
What
when
did you
I,
mean?
sorry?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
You know when we have a mutation and you want to have an optimistic UI, like
Oh,
you update,
optimistic. Yeah.
yeah, you first update the data
Yes.
and later you wait for the mutation result to replace the data again
Yes.
and hopefully with the same result.
Yes.
So is this something possible here?
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's there for two purposes. It's when you have a query, it's there to fetch data, but you might have a subscription that updates that data. So what you can do is like you can have a query that you define, and I wish I had an example here. We were going to create an example with the Git status, but we never got that far.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can do that. So we can kind of do a little bit of implementation at least. Let's just implement that. So,
Cool.
so let's imagine that we want this Git status, and our Git status. The thing that we're doing wrong now in our app is that we have a default, like an initial state for our Git status, which makes absolutely no sense, because it's wrong. Like while we're waiting for the Git status to come from Pitcher, we have
Mm-hmm.
like default to main, and we don't have any remotes and stuff, which is interesting because what if we were waiting for a list? So for example, when we wait for the client's list, like who's connected to Pitcher, that could be an empty array. That's fine to have as an initial state, but not for Git status, which is also like a complicating factor of state management. Like, how do you deal with that stuff? Anyways, so what we can do here is that we can use a query and then Pitcher clients get status. So let's just return our own thing here. And then, yeah, let's just call it git status like this. So now any component, like this is a query, any component can suspend if we want to do that. It can subscribe to the state of the status, but we also want to keep it up to date. So what we can do here is I'm going to just use the cleanup. So it stops the subscription when the scope is unmounted. And what we want to do is Pitcher clients git on git, what's it called? On status updated. Well, that's function handle git status updated. Updated. What do we call this? Is it protocol? Yeah, git status. I think that's right. Doesn't this return? Oh, it returns. Ah, that's so annoying. Oh, wait a minute. Oh. We have this disposer thing. Dispose status updated. There we go. There we go. Oh. God damn it. Dispose. That's how we need to do it. Anyways, so when we get an update, we can point to git status. So this is the query, and then we can just set value, updated git status. And that means that, like, we don't know beforehand what part of our UI is going to require this git status. We kind of know now, of course, but in this version of the app, we don't know that. So it doesn't matter who does things first. Like, either someone is calling git status.suspend, for example, and that triggers the fetch. But we might also get git status from Pitcher before anything in the UI is actually asking for that status. And that will set the query to fulfilled, which means that when you suspend after that, it will just immediately work. It synchronously reads that fulfilled value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does a lot of sense. It's so great. Like there's so many. I mean, it's so flexible, and it's amazing to think that when you want to use the state, it's already there.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as I said, sometimes it makes sense to like have an initial value, but sometimes it doesn't make sense, and
Yeah.
this just handles that. And then git status is such a good example because it's sometimes it probably makes sense to use suspend. For example, in our commits panel, we would probably use suspend there because it's like the whole thing should not render until we actually have the git status. But then we have our status badge, and our status badge is one component going through a ton of different checks. Like, is it protected? Is it doing this? Is it doing that? And in that case, we might want to rather fetch it and look at the query state. So we didn't block the rest of the rendering. We would just only show git status if it was actually fulfilled. And then we have maybe a mutation somewhere that needs to know about the git status to evaluate what the mutation is going to do. And then we would just use like get value on this git status and await that promise. And if it's fulfilled, it immediately resolves. And if not, it would actually go and grab it and wait for it. So you kind of abstract away all of that stuff.
I remember seeing this exact same problem in a different scope, which is tasks. Like I needed to use tasks, but I didn't know when it was ready to be used.
Yeah.
And then I have to implement some similar pattern, but like I asked for okay get tasks, but maybe it's not there yet. Maybe Pitcher doesn't send the data I wanted to have.
Yeah.
And then I needed to create a use effect to listen for tasks update.
Yeah.
And then it started to seem weird, like why I'm updating my state twice when I just wanted to use it for once, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's
And
really
then now
interesting.
and now I can see how now it has this more solid in the visual weight, so this kind of problem.
Yeah. So you kind of just put it in one place. And I think a lot of confusion was like in this branch we're working on here, I removed the I think we called async value store inside Pitcher client because we tried to like solve this inside Pitcher client so that Pitcher client would kind of hold this one true value for you. but you would still have to subscribe to it to get updates from it. And then we had this issue with Git status, like we're just giving this weird initial value, because you really need to wait for it before you can use it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just this, and the motivation behind doing that was because it was so awkward to consume these promises and subscriptions in the React app. So we tried to solve it in Picture Client, but what seems more obvious to me now is that we just haven't had a good primitive in the React world to kind of bridge these two different worlds of like promises and subscriptions,
Yeah,
and being
totally.
able to share it efficiently across the app.
Yeah, this is so cool.
But yeah, I hope we can do another stream where we actually like continue on this and we'll implement the create PR flow, because then it becomes like that's like the big test, because that's an incredibly complicated implementation in the current app.
Mm-hmm.
And like in my head, this should be extremely straightforward using these primitives. But that would be like the test, and then um,
Yeah, let's do it. And then we can prove this point,
yeah,
and then that maybe slowly introducing this for real.
yeah, that would be cool. And also like for me now, it's like I think for like the impact tool, I kind of found the primitives and like the implementation. I feel like it's done, but it's more like how, like just the terminology of it, like how
Mm-hmm.
do you understand what the tool is trying to do, and how does it try to help you. um, and just you talking about data boundary is like, oh yes, of course, that's like a hook to understand better what it tries to do. um, and then yeah, we'll see what happens.
Cool.
Cool. But this was nice.
Exciting.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess it was a little bit jumping around in the beginning, but I think that's the case with like we do a lot of sessions, like trying to analyze product requirements and figuring out like what the hell does this actually mean, and you just have to start somewhere, and then you
Mm-hmm.
go back and
Okay.
forth, and then you kind of build up a full mental image of what it's trying to do. Um, nice. But yeah, I'll invite you to another session and we can implement the PR flow.
Yeah, I'll be there. It's I'm so curious to
So
yeah, so curious to see this for real and start to
yeah,
remove a lot of code.
yeah, I think so. And it will be fun. Like you can jump into the same branch as me, and then we can show some collaboration features of
Oh, cool.
CodeSandbox as
Yeah.
well, because it separates like UI and like we need some UI to show what we're doing as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we could play with
Yeah.
that.
I can do
Cool.
CSS.
Yeah. No, but you gotten your hands dirty with state management and even picture. That's actually really impressive, Danilo. Like, because I understand you consider yourself more of a like hardcore UI. Like you know how to build great
Mm-hmm.
UIs and attention to detail, and then working inside Picture on our VM is a very different paradigm and mental model.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
it still take a while to figure out how the picture architecture works, but it's I don't know. It seems that I've been working for so long CodeSandbox and CodeSandbox features that it's just intuitive. Okay, maybe I need needs this part of the code. It is maybe it's depend of the this provider. So although I still don't know exactly how feature architecture works, it's very intuitive for me. Um, what is the way to go? And something that I initially thought, okay, this is impossible for me. Now it's like I feel I can indeed collaborate the picture.
yeah.
So yeah, I also impressed.
Yeah, but it's nice. Like, yeah, like if you compare the two of us, like you're so much better at diving into picture than I am diving into UI and CSS. Like I'm a fish on land every time I try to implement some UI. And oh, but like, and I don't give it an effort. That's the problem. Like I could just check some documentation or play around with some props or figure out like, is there a component that kind of looks like this one already?
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm old and lazy, so that's kudos to you. You're young. You're
You
still
should
young.
you should try.
Yeah, I
You're
should.
not so bad. So old. Cool.
Okay, cool. I'll stop the stream and then we'll um, talk next time. I'm not sure when. Maybe we should just do it on Thursday if you have time. Yeah, the kids are home on Thursday. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
All right.
Bye for now.
Right. Thank you.